2008, something happened that was hidden from the world.
Save our constitutional rights. We're not gonna give up the fight. Start a revolution.
It was the Ron Paul revolution.
We haven't followed the Constitution, and that's what we ought to be doing. The system that we have today is ripping off the middle class and the poor. Can you imagine how great a nation we'd have if we didn't have the Federal Reserve System printing all this money?
First wave of censorship went unnoticed by the public because it was effective. They hid the message of liberty and silenced dissent. Amy Allen's campaign video was removed from every authoritarian-controlled platform on the internet.
American people are starved for the truth. When you have a dictatorship or an authoritarian government, truth becomes treasonous. And this is what they do. If you are a whistleblower, or if you're trying to tell the American people that our country is destroying our rule of law and destroying our Constitution, they turn it on and they say, oh, you're committing treason. So essentially there is no Fourth Amendment anymore. And for somebody to tell the American people the truth is a heroic effort.
Drinks bring back all the memories, and the memories bring back your...
I won't forget you, buddy.
When it comes to Ron Paul's greatest contributions, as far as what he's really brought to the table, it's been in politics since the 80s. What do you think is Ron Paul's most important contribution to sort of the American conversation?
Oh, man. I mean, it's just so much. I mean, I think he's the most important. I think he's the most important figure in the 21st century in American politics. And I know I'm sure there could be some people who disagree with me on that, but I really credit him with everything. You know, when you see this entire shift in the whole right half of America, where now it is totally acceptable to be opposed to all foreign interventions, to be opposed to the CIA and the FBI and all of this stuff. I mean, I know there's other factors involved too, but let's get real. If this is like a big tree, who planted that seed? It was Ron Paul who planted.
Claiming there is a choice of a little tyranny is like describing pregnancy as a touch of pregnancy. It is a myth to believe that a mixture of free markets and government central economic planning is a worthy compromise. Both sides use force to deal with these misplaced emotions. Both are authoritarians. Neither endorses voluntarism. Both views ought to be rejected. I have come to one firm conviction after these many years of trying to figure out the plain truth of things. The best chance for achieving peace and prosperity for the maximum number of people worldwide is pursue the cause of liberty. If you find this to be a worthwhile message, spread it throughout the land. And I yield back the balance of my time.
What if our foreign policy of the past century is deeply flawed and has not served our national security interests? What if we wake up one day and realize that the terrorist threat is a predictable consequence of our meddling in the affairs of others and has nothing to do with us being free and prosperous? What if propping up repressive regimes in the Middle East endangers both the United States and Israel? What if occupying countries like Iraq and Afghanistan and bombing Pakistan is directly related to the hatred directed toward us? What if someday it dawns on us that losing over 5,000 American military personnel in the Middle East since 9/11 is not a fair trade-off for the loss of nearly 3,000 American citizens, no matter how many Iraqi, Pakistani, and Afghan people are killed or displaced? What if we finally decide that torture, even if called enhanced interrogation technique, is self-destructive and produces no useful information, and that contracting it out to a third world nation is just as evil? What if it is finally realized that war and military spending is always destructive to the economy? What if all wartime spending is paid for through the deceitful and evil process of inflating and borrowing? What if we finally see that wartime conditions always undermine personal liberty? What if conservatives who preach small government wake up and realize that our interventionist foreign policy provides the greatest incentive to expand the government? What if conservatives understood once again that their only logical position is to reject military intervention and managing an empire throughout the world? What if the American people woke up and understood that the official reasons for going to war are almost always based on lies and promoted by war propaganda in order to serve special interests? What if we as a nation came to realize that the quest for empire eventually destroys all great nations? What if Obama has no intention of leaving Iraq? What if a military draft is being planned for the wars that will spread if our foreign policy is not changed? What if the American people learn the truth, that our foreign policy has nothing to do with national security, that it never changes from one administration to the next? What if war and preparation for war is a racket serving the special interests? What if President Obama is completely wrong about Afghanistan and turns out worse than Iraq and Vietnam put together? What if Christianity actually teaches peace and not preventive wars of aggression? What if diplomacy is found to be superior to bombs and bribes in protecting America? What happens if my concerns are completely unfounded? Nothing. But what happens if my concerns are justified and ignored? Nothing good. And I yield back the balance of my time.
I love, 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 I love.
No other power greater than the power over money, the power to create and contract the money supply, the power to control the purchasing power of your money. Throughout history, this has proven to be the most sought-after monopolistic power of man. It has become more sophisticated over the decades and over the centuries, more sophisticated now and more international in scope than ever before. So I see the issue of power and the control over money as being something that we cannot ignore, we must address. I believe closely associated with this is the issue of morality as well. By what moral right do we have to create purchasing power out of thin air? Whether it's done by the creation of credit or Federal Reserve notes, or whether it's the creation of SDRs in an international scope, by what right do they do this? Is it any more moral to dilute the value of your purchasing power of the money you hold in your wallet than it is for the farmer to dilute the milk supply with water? I would say there's an issue of morality here just as strong as the issue of power.
You can't have a government like this without an income tax, but we don't want a government like this. This is not the kind of government that was designed by our founders of the country. It's not what was written in the Constitution. We've only had an income tax since 1913. But if you want a welfare state, and if you want to police the world and pay for the defense of Japan and Germany, send foreign aid to the Soviet Union, you not only need the income tax, you need the Federal Reserve to print up the money when the deficit is accumulated. So we think the government should be much smaller. If government is small, then you don't need an income tax. The income tax is unnecessary. Again, something happened in the 20th century where the American people decided that there would be...
The 16th Amendment happened, yeah.
Something happened where we have changed our attitude about what we want from our government. We've ushered in this overwhelming runaway welfare state that we cannot afford, and we've also become an American empire where we have troops around the world and we pay for the defense of Japan and Germany and everybody else. But at the same time, you had to have two ways of financing this. One we decided we'd have an income tax that we would start subtly and small that would escalate escalate to the point that it really is the biggest ripoff in the country, along with a Federal Reserve System that allows us to monetize
that happened
debt.
65 years ago.
Well, I know, but since 65 years, we have seen the deterioration of this society that we love. I mean, the Libertarian Society is no longer with us because the amount of tax coming out of the economy is still much greater. The amount of tax the government takes is over 40%. You know, when the Founding Fathers got sick and tired of the British taxing us, they had a tax of about 25%. The American people are rather complacent to put up with this. And so we are a bit, we have enslaved ourselves. Not only are we enslaved through the tax system, but we're enslaved because we keep all the records. If we don't keep the right records, can you imagine this tax simplification bill that just came out? And if we don't learn those forms and do it right, we have a gun pointed at our head by the IRS and say, you're going to be put in prison if you don't learn to fill out those forms. How many times did they have to go through the W-4 form? I mean, the whole thing is ridiculous. We have to keep the information, then we have to turn it over to the government. We then set ourselves up for self-incrimination. Then we are guilty until proven innocent. They say, you owe such and such amount. We are guilty and proven innocent, and then we will go to jail and they confiscate money from our banks.
You got it a little bit wrong, Dr. Paul.
The IRS can come and confiscate our money very easily if they send us a bill and we don't pay it. If they send you a bill at the end of the year and say you did not pay $10,000 on taxes, you jolly well better prove that you don't owe it. It's up to you to hire your attorney and hire your accountants and spend a lifetime or many years of agony to prove yourself innocent with your records that you turn over to them. But back to the general principle, taxation is bad not only because the IRS, I think, is such a vicious organization, but because taxes is confiscation of wealth, because it isn't part of the American tradition. It wasn't what the Founding Fathers intended. It isn't what we had through the 19th century, and it's totally unnecessary in a libertarian society. It's only necessary if we want a government that's going to redistribute wealth and defend the American empire.
Hang on a sec.
You know, there's been taxes early in our history. We had taxes in the 19th century, but they were very minimal. And the people paid them, and they were excises taxes and tariffs and a few things to manage the minimal government that we had and that we wanted. But now that we endorse the welfare warfare state, it is absolutely necessary to have an income tax in order to finance it, and even that isn't enough. $220 billion deficit last year by conservatives. I mean, there's something wrong going on here. What do they, that's why they need the Federal Reserve System in order to monetize all this debt as well. The principle of the withholding element makes it much more sinister than say a consumer tax.
Because it's less conspicuous, yeah.
That's right. So I don't think the income tax would be less conspicuous because most people only believe the tax they pay is the check they write at the end of the year, because the businessman again becomes the slave of the state by collecting all these taxes, keeping all these records, and doing all the things that I don't believe we should be doing. Well, I think, you know, my position right now in the campaign is to make a very important point. Government is too big. Taxes are too high. We can eliminate 40% of taxes by getting rid of the income tax. The point is something has to give, and we have to decide whether we want to change things. We as libertarians want to change things. We want limited government. We don't want to go under the same program of saying, yes, we want limited government of the Reagan style, which expands government rapidly and uncontrollably. Well, this is what has to stop.
I would want people to opt out of the system. I would want people to have medical savings accounts. Young people should be able to opt out and build up a medical savings account and take care of their own programs. But that won't work unless you're willing to cut spending, and I think the most popular place to cut is all the spending overseas and the corporate welfare in this country, because most of the money that we spend here is supposed to help the poor really helps the large corporations. Say the housing bubble. Who got help? See, the rich got bailed out. They got bailed out both by the Congress and the Federal Reserve, and they were making all the profits. So it's corporatism that is so bad. Whether it's medicine or even in education or the military-industrial complex, it's corporatism. That is the welfare that is huge compared to the welfare of food stamps.
Interview we did with a libertarian candidate for president said he would abolish the CIA, the FBI, and the IRS. Do you hold those same positions?
Yes, I do, because you know, most of our history we didn't have those institutions. The FBI came in during the First World War, and interestingly enough, one thing that Woodrow Wilson did, he used the FBI to spy on American citizens and actually arrest them if they disagreed with his foreign policy about going to war in Europe. And isn't it interesting how recent they used it in the Vietnam era? Democrats used it there, and Republicans used the FBI to spy on 100 different groups in this country, including the churches.
who disagree with the policy in Central America. It almost looks like the FBI was designed to spy on Americans who might be disagreeing with policy, especially the foreign policy. So the FBI, although I don't think I could condemn everything they've ever done, because I'm sure some of the investigations and investigation of crime has been beneficial, but that could be accomplished through Justice Department within our states. We wouldn't reject that portion of it. But I think the FBI has kept and continues to keep a lot of records on a lot of individuals. The CIA has only been here since 1947. Their record is lousy. I mean, just think of the CIA used by the Democratic administration to murder Diem and escalate the war in Vietnam. And here we have a Republican using the CIA to sell weapons to the Ayatollah, to raise funds, deal in drugs, go to Central America, fight wars that have not been approved by the people or the Congress. So we see the CIA as very, very detrimental, skirting the law. And here we had Casey proposing a super CIA. He thought there was too much control over the CIA that existed, that congressmen now occasionally ask questions, and they don't ask enough. So they were talking about a super CIA. The CIA was used in a bad policy in Cuba. We think that intelligence gathering is permissible to defend this country. But up until 1947, it was done as a military operation. If you needed to know whether there were troops massing for an invasion, that the CIA ought to know about, or we ought to know, get that information, have that intelligence. But now in this age, especially in the modern age, I mean, we don't even need to have somebody over in Europe or in the Soviet Union. We don't even need to send powers in an airplane over Europe. We have satellites. You can practically watch an individual walking around on the street with the technology available. So I would say even modern technology has absolutely moved us into an age where we ought to become more modern and get away from this CIA operative snooping around, actually causing a lot more trouble than good.
Does that include all these interventions and covert actions and surrogate mercenaries which we're using in Central America?
Absolutely. We would do away with that. But that doesn't mean that we would complacently say that we shouldn't have a national defense. If we're concerned about the spread of communism, one of the first things we as libertarians would do would be to stop the funding of the communists. You know, we're still sending money to the communists. Increased under the Reagan administration. It's unbelievable what we've been doing. But if there is a threat to our national security, rather than using these secretive operatives going around and murdering and picking and choosing our personal dictators that serve our banking and business interests, it should be done through the Congress. Congress should know about it. It's the people's money and it's the kids' lives that are being dealt with. So therefore it should be open. If our national security is threatened, Congress ought to have a vote on it. Never secretly with the power of a president to wage war. That's a very dangerous thing to happen.
Rich. That money was still robbing people. What sense do that make? How are you rich and you're robbing people?
Mr. Speaker, earlier this year, another member severely criticized me on the House floor for declaring on C-SPAN that indeed many Americans justifiably feared their own government. This fear has come from the police state mentality that prompted Ruby Ridge, Waco, and many other episodes of an errant federal government. Under the Constitution, there was never meant to be a federal police force. Even an FBI limited only to investigations was not accepted until this century. Yet today, fueled by the federal government's misdirected war on drugs, radical environmentalism, and the aggressive behavior of the nanny state, we have witnessed the massive buildup of a virtual army of armed regulators prowling the states where they have no legal authority. The sacrifice of individual responsibility and the concept of local government by the majority of American citizens has permitted the army of bureaucrats to thrive. We have depended on government for so much for so long that we as a people have become less vigilant of our liberties. And as long as the government provides largesse for the majority, the special interest lobbyists will succeed in continuing the redistribution of welfare programs that occupies most of Congress's legislative time. Wealth is limited, yet demands are unlimited. A welfare system inevitably diminishes production and shrinks the economic pie. As this occurs, anger among the competing special interests grows. While Congress and the people concentrate on material welfare and its equal redistribution, the principles of liberty are ignored and freedom is undermined. And more immediate, the enforcement of the interventionist state requires a growing army of bureaucrats. Since groups demanding special favors from the federal government must abuse the rights and property of those who produce wealth and cherish liberty, real resentment is directed at the agents who come to eat out our substance. The natural consequence is for the intruders to arm themselves to protect against angry victims of government intrusion. Thanks to a recent article by Joseph Farah, director of the Western Journalism Center of Sacramento, California, appearing in the Houston Chronicle, the surge in the number of armed federal bureaucrats have been brought to our attention. Farah points out that in 1996 alone, at least 2,439 new federal cops were authorized to carry firearms. That takes the total up to nearly 60,000. Farah points out that these cops were not only in agencies like the FBI, but include the EPA, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife, the Army Corps of Engineers. Even Bruce Babbitt, according to Farah, wants to arm the Bureau of Land Management. Farah logically asks, when will the NEA have its armed art cops? This is a dangerous trend. It's ironic that the proliferation of guns in the hands of the bureaucrats is pushed by the anti-gun fanatics who hate the Second Amendment and would disarm every law-abiding American citizen. Yes, we need gun control. We need to disarm our bureaucrats, then abolish the agencies. If government bureaucrats like guns that much, let them seek work with the NRA. Force and intimidation are the tools of tyrants. Intimidation with government guns and the threat of imprisonment and the fear of harassment by government agents put fear into the hearts of millions of Americans. 4 days after Paula Jones refused a settlement in her celebrated suit, she received notice that she and her husband would be audited for 1995 taxes. Since 1994 is the current audit year for the IRS, the administration's denial that the audit is related to the suit is suspect, to say the least. Even if it is coincidental, don't try to convince the American people. Most Americans, justifiably cynical and untrusting toward the federal government, know the evidence exists that since the 1970s, both Republican and Democratic administrations have not hesitated to intimidate their political enemies with IRS audits and regulatory harassment. Even though the average IRS agent doesn't carry a gun, the threat of incarceration and seizure of property is backed up by many guns. All government power is ultimately gun power and serves the interests of those who despise or do not comprehend the principles of liberty. The gun in the hands of law-abiding citizens serve to hold in check arrogant and aggressive government. Guns in the hands of the bureaucrats do the opposite. The founders of this country fully understood this fact. And I yield back.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks. Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to the resolution, and not obviously because it condemns violence. We all condemn the violence, but there's more to this resolution than just condemning the violence. I have a problem with most resolutions like this because it endorses a foreign policy that I don't endorse, and it also does that. It does that by putting demands. So the demands part of this is the part that I object to, not the condemnation of violence. And by doing this, we serve to antagonize. We here today talk about having solidarity with Israel, and others get up and try in their best way to defend the Palestinians and the Arabs. So it's sort of a contest. Should we be pro-Israel or pro-Arab or anti-Israel or anti-Arab, and how are we seen in doing this? And it's pretty important. But I think there's a third option to this that we so often forget about. Why can't we be pro-American? What is in the best interest of the United States? We haven't even heard that yet. I believe that it's in the best interest of the United States not to get into a fight that we don't have the wisdom to figure out. Now, I would like to have neutrality. That's been the tradition for America at least a century ago. To be friends with everybody, trade with everybody, and to be neutral, unless somebody declares war against us, but not to demand that we pick sides. And yet, this is what we're doing. And I think our perceptions are so bad because it's not intended that we make the problem worse. Obviously, the authors of the resolution, they don't want to make the problem worse. But you have to realize perceptions are pretty important. So the perceptions are, yes, we have solidarity. What is the opposite of solidarity? It's hostility. So if you have solidarity with Israel, then you have hostility to the others. Now, I have a proposal and a suggestion, which I think fits the American tradition, that we should treat both sides equally, but in a different way. Today, we treat both sides equally by giving both sides money and telling them what to do. Not $1 million here or there, not $100 million here or there, but tens of billions of dollars over decades, always trying to buy peace. And my argument is that it generally doesn't work, that there are unintended consequences. These things backfire. They come back to haunt us. So I think we should start off by defunding both sides. I'm just not for giving all this money, because every time there are civilians killed on the Israeli side or civilian killed on the Palestinian side, you can be assured that either our money was used directly or indirectly to do that killing. So we are, in a way, an accomplice on all this because we fund both sides. So I would argue to consider neutrality, to consider friendship with both sides, and not to pretend that we are all so wise that we know exactly with whom to have solidarity with. I think that's basically our problem. We have a policy that is doomed to fail in the Middle East, and it fails slowly and persistently, always drawing us in, always demanding more money. With the Arabs, we can't tell the Arabs to get lost. The Arabs are important. They have a lot of oil over there. I mean, we can't flaunt the Arabs and say, get lost. We must protect our oil. It's called our oil. And at the same time, there's a strong constituency for never offending Israel. I think that you can't buy peace under those circumstances. I think that we can contribute to being more neutral. I think we can contribute a whole lot by being friends with both sides, but I believe the money is wasted. It's spent unwisely, and it actually does not serve the interests of the American people. First, it costs us money. That means that we have to take this money from the American taxpayer. And second, it doesn't achieve the peace that we all hope to have. So therefore, the policy of foreign non-intervention, where the United States is not the bully and doesn't come in and tell everybody exactly what to do and put these demands on. If we didn't do that, yes, we could have some moral authority to condemn violence, but should we not condemn violence equally? Could it be true that only innocent civilians have died on one side and not the other? I don't believe that to be true. I believe that it happens on both sides, and on both sides they use our money to do this. I urge a no vote on this resolution.
Gentleman's time has expired.
But you know, just going for increasing presidential powers, as been discussed, is rather disturbing to me. This whole idea that we're supposed to sacrifice liberty for security, we were advised against that. Don't we remember that when you sacrifice liberty for security, you lose both? That's what's happening in this country today.
A lot of merit to the advice of the founders and following the Constitution. And my argument is that we shouldn't go to war so carelessly. When we do, the wars don't end.
Congressman, you don't think that changed with the 9/11 attacks, sir?
What changed?
The non-interventionist policies.
No, non-intervention was a major contributing factor. Have you ever read about the reasons they attacked us? They attack us because we've been over there. We've been bombing Iraq for 10 years. We've been in the Middle East. I think Reagan was right. We don't understand the irrationality of Middle Eastern politics. So right now we're building an embassy in Iraq that's bigger than the Vatican. We're building 14 permanent bases. What would we say here if China was doing this in our country or in the Gulf of Mexico? We would be objecting. We need to look at what we do from the perspective of what would happen if somebody else did it to us.
Are you suggesting we invited the 9/11 attack, sir?
I'm suggesting that we listen to the people who attacked us and the reason they did it. And they are delighted that we're over there because Osama bin Laden has said, I am glad you're over on our sand because we can target you so much easier. They've already now, since that time, have killed 3,400 of our men, and I don't think it was necessary.
Wendell, may I make a comment on that? That's really an extraordinary statement. That's an extraordinary statement as someone who lived through the attack of September 11, that we invited the attack because we were attacking Iraq. I don't think I've ever heard that before, and I've heard some pretty absurd explanations for September 11. I would ask the congressman to withdraw that comment and tell us that he didn't really mean that.
Congressman?
I believe very sincerely that the CIA is correct when they teach and talk about blowback. When we went into Iran in 1953 and installed the Shah, yes, there was blowback. The reaction to that was the taking of our hostages, and that persists. And if we ignore that at our own risk. That if we think that we can do what we want around the world and not incite hatred, then we have a problem. They don't come here to attack us because we're rich and we're free. They come and they attack us because we're over there. I mean, what would we think if we were if other foreign countries were doing that to us?
Oh, there's no reading in between context. I'm not a fucking poet. I said what I said. What you mean by that? You heard me. You heard every individual word of what I just said.
I was recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Federal Reserve is the culprit. It has delivered this crisis to us. The Federal Reserve's low interest rate policy is a big mistake. It is not a panacea. Artificially low interest rates are achieved by inflating the money supply. Low interest rates penalize the thrifty, and those who save are cheated. It promotes consumption and borrowing over savings and investing. Manipulating interest rates is an immoral act. It is economically destructive. The policy of artificially low interest rates caused our problems and therefore cannot be the solution. The market rate of interest is crucial information for the smooth operation of the economy. A central bank setting interest rates is price fixing and is a form of central economic planning. Price fixing is a tool of socialists and destroys production. Central bankers, politicians, and bureaucrats can't know what the proper rate should be. They lack the knowledge and are deceived by their own aggrandizement. Manipulating the money supply and interest rates rejects all the principles of the free market. Ironically, free markets and sound money generates low rates, but unlike the artificially low rates orchestrated by the Fed, this information conveyed is beneficial to investors and savers. The Congress, by conceding this authority, conveys extraordinary economic powers to the elite few. This is a power that has been abused throughout history. Only the Federal Reserve can inflate the currency, creating new money and credit out of thin air, in secrecy, without oversight or supervision. Inflation facilitates deficits, needless wars, and excessive welfare spending. Debasing a currency is counterfeiting. It steals value from every dollar earned or saved. It robs the people and makes them poorer. It is the enemy of the working person. Inflation is the most vicious and regressive of all forms of taxation. It transfers wealth from the middle class to the privileged rich. The economic chaos that results from a policy of central bank inflation inevitably leads to political instability and violence. It is an ancient tool of all authoritarians. Inflating is never a benefit to freedom-loving people. It destroys prosperity and feeds the fires of war. It is responsible for recessions and depressions. It's deceptive, addictive, and causes delusions of grandeur with regards to wealth and knowledge. Wealth cannot be achieved by creating money by fiat. It instead destroys wealth, and it rewards the special interests. Depending on monetary fraud for national prosperity or a reversal of our downward spiral is riskier than depending on the lottery. Inflation has been used to pay for all the wars and empires, and they all end badly. Inflationism and corporatism engenders protectionism and trade wars. It prompts scapegoating, blaming foreigners, illegal immigrants, ethnic minorities, and too often freedom itself for the predictable events and suffering that results. Besides, the whole process is unconstitutional. There is no legal authority to operate such a monetary system. So let's stop it. Let us restore a policy of prosperity, peace, and liberty. The time has come. Let's end the Fed. Back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Hare, Illinois. Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, in my first week, I already got rid of the income tax. So my second week, I would get rid of the inflation tax. It's a tax that nobody talks about. We live way beyond our means with a foreign policy we can't afford and an entitlement system that we have encouraged. We print money for it, the value of the money goes down, and poor people pay higher prices. That is a tax. It's a transfer of wealth from the poor and the middle class to Wall Street. Wall Street's doing quite well, but the inflation tax is eating away at the middle class of this country. We need to get rid of the inflation tax with sound money.
I just want to also say that Congressman Paul, I've heard him now in many debates talking about bringing our troops home and about the war in Iraq and how it's failed. And I want to tell you that that kind of isolationism, sir, is what caused World War II. Allow him his answer, please. We allowed Hitler to come to power with that kind of attitude of isolationism and appeasement. Okay. And I want to tell you something, sir. I just finished having Thanksgiving with the troops, and their message to you is, the message of these brave men and women who are serving over there is, let us win. Let us win. That's what they want.
We will, please. We will get to Iraq. All right. Let me just remind everyone that these people did take a lot of time to ask these questions, and so we do want direct questions to the answers. We will get to Iraq later, but I do have to allow Congressman Paul 30 seconds to respond.
Absolutely. The real question you have to ask is, why do I get the most money from active duty officers, military personnel? So what John is saying is just totally distorted. He doesn't even understand the difference between non-intervention and isolationism. I'm not an isolationist. I want to trade with people, talk with people, travel, but I don't want to send our troops overseas using force to tell them how to live. We would object to it here, and they're going to object to us over there.
All right, we will have a lot more on Iraq coming up. It's obviously a very heated topic.
We want freedom to pick the future, our future in a spiritual way, but not when it comes to our personal habits.
But Senator, are you suggesting that heroin and prostitution are an exercise of liberty?
Well, I probably never used those words. You've put those words someplace. But, yes, in essence, if I leave it to the states, it's going to be up to the states. Up until this past century, for over 100 years they were legal. What you're inferring is, you know what? If we legalized heroin tomorrow, everybody's going to use heroin. How many people here would use heroin if it was legal? I bet nobody would put their hand, oh, yeah, I need the government to take care of me. I don't want to use heroin, so I need these laws.
I never thought heroin would get applause here in South Carolina.
That raises the question, if you were President of the United States, would you need to go to Congress to get authorization to take military action against Iran's nuclear facilities?
You sit down with your attorneys and tell you what you have to do, but obviously the President of the United States has to do what's in the best interest of the United States to protect us against a potential threat. The President did that as he was planning on moving into Iraq and received the authorization of Congress.
Did he need it?
We're going to let the lawyers sort out what he needed to do and what he didn't need to do, but certainly what you want to do.
Gentlemen, it's so important. Congressman Paul, do you believe the President needs authorization of Congress to attack strategic targets in Iran, nuclear facilities?
Absolutely. This idea of going and talking to attorneys totally baffles me. Why don't we just open up the Constitution and read it? You're not allowed to go to war without a declaration of war. Now, as far as fleeting enemies go, yes, if there's an imminent attack on us, we've never had that happen in 220 years. The thought that the Iranians could pose an imminent attack on the United States is preposterous. There's no way. This is just war propaganda, continued war propaganda, preparing this nation to go to war and spread this war not only in Iraq but into Iran unconstitutionally. It is a road to disaster for us as a nation. It's a road to our financial disaster if we don't read the Constitution once in a while.
Around the horn, Congressman.
Congressman Paul, South Carolina has 7 major military bases and thousands of people employed in the defense industry. But you want to make major cuts in defense spending, several $100 billion in the coming years, that inevitably would cost South Carolina jobs. What do you say to people in this state who worry that your military plans would hurt the national security and cost South Carolina jobs?
I would say your question suggests you're very confused about my position. I want to cut money, overseas money. That's what I want to do. I want to cut military money. I don't want to cut defense money. I want to bring the troops home. I'd probably have more bases here at home. We were closing them down in the 1990s and building them overseas. That's how we got into trouble. So we would save a lot more money and have a stronger national defense, and that's what we should do. But to say that we would be weaker is absolutely wrong, because and another important thing you should consider is the fact that the military is behind me more than the others. I get twice as much money from the active military duties than all the other candidates put together. So they're saying that I'm on the right track. They're sick and tired of those wars. They're sick and tired of the nation building and the policing activity. But to say that we would have less money for defense, we actually have more money. And if I may, I'd like to go back to the international financial thing.
So, Congressman, just to be clear, your plan calls for freezing defense spending at 2006 levels, which is well below where we are today.
You still don't understand.
What's he missing, Congressman?
You don't understand there's a difference between military spending and defense spending. Just because you spend $1 billion on an embassy in Baghdad, bigger than the Vatican, you consider that defense spending. I consider that waste. So now, if you want to... A little while ago, we were talking about, funding the unemployed. Of course, that should be privatized, and I don't support it. But I don't support cutting that off like that. I'd cut some of this military spending, like Eisenhower advised us. Watch out for the military-industrial complex. Defend this country. We have to have a strong national defense, but we don't get strength by diluting ourselves in 900 bases, 130 countries. That is where the problem is. But you need to understand that there's a difference between just military spending and defense spending. Just to spend money. We understand this domestically. If you spend more money domestically, we know it's wrong, but we're supposed to spend more money, and that's conservative. I've never quite understood this. We're supposed to be conservative, spend less money.
I'd like to...
Wait till I get my money right. I had a dream I could find my way to heaven. When I woke, I spit that on a necklace.
Why wouldn't we legalize competing currencies? Why couldn't people put this in a mattress and get 4 or 5 times much of the value in a few years? So the record of what you've done in the last 6 years is destroy the value of real money.
First of all, good to see you again, Congressman Paul. Just one word on the inflation. Of course, those numbers are constructed by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, not by the Fed. They're independently constructed, and I think they're done in a very serious and thoughtful way. On alternative currencies, nobody prevents you from holding.
I mean, when you pay taxes to buy a coin, or you have capital gains tax, when it's not, if you have to settle a lawsuit, it's always settled in depreciating Federal Reserve notes. It's never settled in the real contract. So that's nothing near money. The Federal Reserve is given a responsibility to protect the value of the dollar. That's what stable prices are all about.
The thick of it out in Iowa, basically in a statistical tie with Romney, with Kaine, and with Mr. Gingrich. So I want to ask you some questions now that you're among the front runners. We need to know more about your positions on the issues. And I want to start with foreign policy, because your statements over the years, posted on your website and elsewhere, some of the things you have said in the debates, suggest that you believe that 9/11 happened because of actions that the United States took. Is that correct?
Well, I think there's an influence, and that's exactly what the 9/11 Commission said. That's what the DOD has said, and that's also what the CIA has said, and that's what a lot of researchers have said. And just remember, immediately after 9/11, we removed the base from Saudi Arabia. So there is a connection. That doesn't do the whole full explanation, but our policies definitely had an influence. And you talk to the people who committed it and those individuals who would like to do us harm, they say, yes, we don't like American bombs to be falling on our country, and we don't like the intervention that we do in their nations. So to deny this, I think, is very dangerous. But to argue the case that they want to do us harm because we're free and prosperous, I think is a very, very dangerous notion, because it's not true.
Well, I would question the import of what some of those commissions found that you cited there. But basically what you're saying, Mr. Paul, is that it was America's fault, that 9/11 happened, and it was our fault that it happened.
No, I think that's a misconstruing of what I'm saying, because America is you and I, and we didn't cause it. The average American didn't cause it. But if you have a flawed policy, it may influence it. When Ronald Reagan went into Lebanon, he deeply regretted this, because he said if he'd have been more neutral, those Marines wouldn't have died in Lebanon, because the policy was flawed. The same thing that McNamara said after the Vietnam War, and he wrote in his memoirs that, if he would have changed, if we don't learn from our policies, it won't be worth anything. So I'm saying policies have an effect, but that's a far cry from blaming America.
Well,
I mean, in America, you're supposed to be able to criticize your own government. You're supposed to be able to criticize your own government without saying you're un-American.
But
that's what the implication is.
But what you are saying, it was the government's fault. That basically is what you are saying. Let me move on from something else.
I'm saying the policymakers' fault.
The policymakers' fault.
Contributed to it.
All right.
If you look at the history, you'll find out that Hamas was encouraged and really started by Israel, because they wanted Hamas to counteract Yasser Arafat. And you say, well, yeah, that was better then and served its purpose, but we didn't want Hamas to do this. So then we as Americans say, well, we have such a good system, we're going to impose this on the world. We're going to invade Iraq and teach people how to be Democrats. We want free elections. So we encourage the Palestinians to have a free election. They do, and they elect Hamas. So we first, indirectly and directly through Israel, help establish Hamas. Then we have an election. Then Hamas becomes dominant, so we have to kill them. It just doesn't make sense. During the 80s, we were allied with Osama bin Laden. And we were contending with the Soviets. It was at that time our CIA thought it was good if we radicalized the Muslim world. So we financed the madrasa schools to radicalize the Muslims in order to compete with the Soviets. There's too much blowback. There's a lot of reasons why we should oppose this resolution. It is not in the interest of the United States. It's not in the interest of Israel either.
Interfere with them. We interfere with them When they deal with their borders, when they want to have peace treaties, we tell them what they can do because we buy their allegiance and they sacrifice their sovereignty to us. And then they decide they want to bomb something. That's their business, but they should, suffer the consequences. When they bombed the Iraqi missile site, nuclear site back in the 80s, I was one of the few in Congress that said it's none of our business and Israel should take care of themselves. Israel has 200, 300 nuclear missiles and they can take care of themselves. Why should we commit? We don't even have a treaty with Israel. Why do we have this automatic commitment that we're going to send our kids and send our money endlessly to Israel? So I think they're quite capable of taking care of themselves. I think we do detriment. Just think of all the money we gave to Egypt over 30 or 40 years. Now look, we were buying friendship. Now there's a civil war. They're less friendly to Israel. That whole thing is going to backfire once we go bankrupt and we remove our troops. So I think we should be very cautious in our willingness to go to war and send troops without a proper declaration by the U.S. Congress.
There is a hook in me, one that you cannot see. And you think I have a choice? There is no fucking choice.
Aimed if we called it Obsession with Iran Act 2012. Because this is what we continue to be doing, is obsessed with Iran and the idea that Iran is a threat to our national security. Iran happens to be a third world nation. They have no significant Navy, Air Force, intercontinental ballistic missiles. The IAEA and our CIA said they're not on the verge of a nuclear weapon. It's so similar to what we went through in the early part of this last decade when we were beating the war drums to go to war against Iraq. And it was all a facade. There was no danger from Iraq. So this is what we're doing, beating the war drums once again. Now, since the bill has come back from the conference, we're going to deal with civil liberties in Syria. Well, I happen to be a civil libertarian. I'm very concerned about civil liberties. But let me tell you, this bill is not going to do anything to enhance the civil liberties of the individuals in Syria. Now, if we were really interested in the civil liberties, why wouldn't we look to ourselves? Why wouldn't we look to the things that we do here? What about our warrantless searches under the Patriot Act? What about the policy of assassination and assassinating American citizens? What about arrest by the military, National Defense Authorization Act? What about the drone warfare that we go on? Do you think we're protecting civil liberties by arbitrarily dropping drones or threatening to drop drones any place in the world with innocent people dying? If we want to really care about civil liberties in Syria, why don't we care about the secret prisons we have and the history of torture that we've had in this country? What about the fact that kill lists are being made by the executive branch of government and we sit idly by and approve of it by saying nothing, and the American people put up with it, and we march in this direction, marching into a determination to have another war. When you put on sanctions on a country, it's an act of war, and that's what this is all about. The first thing you do when war breaks out between two countries is you put sanctions on countries. You blockade the country. So this is an act of war. What would we do if somebody blockaded and put sanctions on us and prevented the importation of any product in this country? We'd be furious, we'd declare war, we'd go to war. So we are the antagonists. We're over there poking our nose in other people's affair, just looking for the chance to start another war. First it's Syria, then Iran. We have too many wars. We need to stop the wars. We don't have the money to fight these wars any longer.
President Trump, stop bombing Yemen and exit the Middle East. Was Yemen in the process of attacking the United States? No. Did the president in that case go to Congress and seek a declaration of war against the country? No. Yemen hadn't even threatened the United States before the bombs started falling.
Breaking news overseas right now, where officials are confirming to ABC News that U.S. air and naval assets hit dozens of Houthi targets in Yemen, including missiles, radar, drones, and air defense systems.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the weekly report. President Trump, stop bombing Yemen and exit the Middle East. Over the weekend, President Trump ordered a massive military operation against the small country of Yemen. Was Yemen in the process of attacking the United States? No. Did the president in that case go to Congress and seek a declaration of war against the country? No. The fact is, Yemen hadn't even threatened the United States before the bombs started falling. Last year, candidate Trump strongly criticized the Biden administration's obsession with foreign interventionism to the detriment of our problems at home. In an interview at the Libertarian National Convention, he criticized Biden's warmongering to podcaster Tim Pool, saying, "You can solve problems over a telephone. Instead, they start dropping bombs. Recently, they're dropping bombs all over Yemen. You don't have to do that."
But I don't want to see wars. I think it's so horrible, so unnecessary, so costly in terms of lives and money in that order, and destroying these countries. You know, you're destroying culture. When you look at Ukraine, that would have never happened if I were president. You look at the October 7th attack on Israel, it would have never happened.
I look at your policies, I see secure the borders, bring jobs back. I look at the Democrats and many Republicans, and it's foreign war and foreign expansion.
That's right.
What is that?
I think it's just a failed mentality. It's crazy. You can solve problems over a telephone. Instead, they start dropping bombs. I see recently they're dropping bombs all over Yemen. You don't have to do that. You can talk in such a way where they respect you and they listen to you. Viktor Orban of Hungary, you know, the leader, they call him a strong man. Who cares if he's a strong man or not a strong man? He's a very powerful guy. He said the problem the world has is that Donald Trump is no longer president. When he was president, China didn't play around, Russia didn't play around, nobody played around, and we had no problems. Today, the whole world is on fire.
What a fucking bitch, bruh, honestly. And if I had a damn missile, if I had a spare missile, I'd throw it at that bitch, man. I really, really would.
In fact, polls show that the majority of Americans oppose providing military aid to Israel or other countries. U.S. ownership of Gaza, accompanied by forcible relocation of Palestinians, would cause increased resentment of the United States. Even if a long-term U.S. occupation of Gaza went 100% according to plan, the U.S. government, which has an over $36 trillion and growing debt, cannot afford another open-ended overseas military commitment. Trump Gaza's proposal is the type of wasteful overseas spending that DOGE should be working to eliminate. President Trump should follow through on his campaign rhetoric about withdrawing from unnecessary military commitments. This, not tariffs, will help make America more competitive on the international economy. The best thing the United States can do to rebuild Gaza and promote peace in the Middle East is to stop funding Israel's occupation and blockade of Gaza. Instead, the U.S. should work toward peaceful relations backed by free trade.
Let me be clear. There's only one thing that's important to me, and it's not friendship. It's dominance.
Hey now.
It's Garnet from Steven Universe!
Kids, don't be racist.
I don't know if you can think of a people who were more held back, more deprived, more sabotaged than African Americans. You took everything away from them and took them away from everything. They started in your country at less than zero, literally regarded and treated as subhuman, not allowed to learn to read or write or anything for hundreds of years. But you see, they come from a people of accomplishment to one degree or another, not a people of piracy and theft and appropriation. They come from a people who created and built and developed in their own land. And even though you did everything that you could possibly do to suppress them, to hold them down, to hold them back, and you're still doing that until today, nevertheless, I don't think anyone can dispute the fact that African Americans have become a global cultural superpower. Culturally, they're a superpower. Whatever cultural soft power that America has in the global South, it's African American.
And especially the African American experience. It's literally not duplicated anywhere on earth in history. African Americans are a completely unique phenomenon as a people. Who they are culturally, what their history is, what their experience is, isn't duplicated anywhere on earth. You don't know where you came from. You don't know what country you came from. You don't know what culture you came from. You don't know what language you came from. You don't know what your religion was before. You, like I've said before, you're more American than anyone because you don't have any other identity. Actually, your entire identity is American-based. That's not the case of anyone else. I'm Irish American. I'm German American. I'm Italian American. I'm Jewish American. I'm this or that, the other. You can say African American, but you don't know anything about Africa. You don't even know which part of Africa. Africans don't call themselves that because I know my tribe. I have my language. I have my region, my country, my whatever. Like me saying European American. I'm not European. I'm specifically Irish and German. But you can't say that. You are American. You're the original Americans. You know? Everyone else is immigrants. You can't even be called immigrants. Yeah. You know? You're originally American. And your culture is as close to being the indigenous culture of America as there can be without you being the indigenous people. You know? You're the indigenous people of the entity called America, called the United States of America. Everything else came from elsewhere. Your culture is the only one that came from right there because you were cut off from everything else. You know, there's nobody else like that. There's nobody else like that in the world. There's no other culture like that in the world.
This comment shows that you do understand and acknowledge what white privilege is, because white people do not experience racism. They don't spend time thinking about racism. Systemic racism does not impede the ability of white people to thrive through jobs, money, family, and friends. I think what you meant is that white people don't spend time thinking about how to be racist towards others, but obviously that's not true of all white people. Some white people do. That, coupled with the fact that most white people don't think about how racism negatively impacts others, is how white supremacy culture is upheld. I find that a good way to help people who have a different lived experience than you exercise empathy for the struggles that you face that they may not be familiar with is to help them understand. And I was hoping that you could help me understand what anti-white racism looks like. Can you tell me about how you don't know where your ancestors came from because they were kidnapped and enslaved? Or how you don't know what languages they spoke, what spiritual practices they had, or what traditional knowledge that should have been your birthright was lost, not because they were allowed to and wanted to assimilate, but because their enslavers or residential schools forced them to assimilate. Can you tell me about how your ancestors had explosives tied to them while they were building the United States railroads, and then as a show of appreciation, they were excluded from society for nearly 60 years? And could you tell me about the hundreds of towns that were destroyed, like the Black towns and Chinatowns and Japan towns, all destroyed by the same demographic? Can you tell me about the children who were unalived because they whistled at a woman or because they floated in a lake a little too far past the segregation line? And can you tell me how it was for your parents and your grandparents to be United States citizens who were put in internment camps on United States soil? Can you tell me how it was for your family to live in the back of their store because people who look like you were not allowed to purchase or rent homes? And could you tell me how it was for your parents and for you to shed blood, to be treated as human, as equal, and to be allowed to simply share the same space as other people? Can you tell me about the conversations that you have to have with your children about police interactions? And could you tell me about how your mother and your sisters and your daughters are concerned about having children because of lack of equitable access to health care, because doctors were told that people who look like you can't feel pain? Can you tell me how it feels to know that your ancestors lived here for thousands of years, but when you try to come here, you and your children are put in cages? And can you tell me how it felt when a few years ago, the president entertained having people who look like you expelled from the country again? Can you tell me what anti-white racism looks like beyond having your feelings hurt, feeling uncomfortable, and having your sense of superiority challenged? And when you're done telling me what anti-white racism feels like for you, could you please tell me why you're not fighting to end racism for everybody?
I'm doing my part.
I'm doing my part.
I'm doing my part. I didn't do fucking shit.
Because the Red Scares completely destroyed the ability to have anything other than just binary thinking, where on one side is America and then obviously everything else is just communism, I can't blame a person for thinking this. So left and right has absolutely nothing to do with GOP and Dems. It has to do with economics. So on the right, you have varying degrees of capitalism, where people believe that whoever makes this stuff and owns that company deserves all of the surplus from that product. And then people on the left believe that the workers deserve the surplus from that, and there's no need for owners, in varying degrees. Now, up and down on the scale deals with levels of authority. As you can see, people on the left that belong to the Communist Party with a big C believe in high levels of authority because they believe the state is what is to bring in the change. A person like me, I fall on the libertarian scale of the spectrum, where I don't believe in any state or any kind of authority whatsoever. I believe in free association and self-determination. So my political ideas and thoughts really align more with somebody like Noam Chomsky or Mikhail Bakunin or Joseph Proudhon or even Kropotkin. So the video I made that was even referring to this had nothing to do with political thought or theory. It was just a historical piece on a black organizer for the IWW celebrating his 135th birthday. The truth of the matter is, socialism is not anti-American. Socialism is as American as apple pie, and it has its own history that's completely devoid of Marxism. And it's not that I'm necessarily even against Marxism. I do agree with his critique on capitalism, but America has its own history. Fun fact, in 1912, 1,200 people from the Socialist Party were elected to government office. So it doesn't have to be a four-letter word.
I am within the libertarian left quadrant, or social liberal or social libertarian quadrant if you divide the politics in terms of economic left, right, and social authoritarian libertarian. My position in the left-right spectrum can vary depending on the issue and my mood. I am pro-small government, pro-state regulated capitalism with free markets, and pro-social justice with reduced wealth inequality, and totally against racism and injustice and discrimination.
The general public might have funny ideas about corporate control. For example, people who really believe in democracy, people who take 18th century values seriously, people who really might merit the term conservatives, that much abused term, are against concentration of power. They remember that after all, the doctrines of the Enlightenment held that individuals should be free from the coercion of concentrated power. Well, the kind of concentrated power that they were thinking about was the church and the state and the feudal system and so on, and that you could sort of imagine a population of relatively equal people, at least equal white male property owners, who would be not controlled by those private powers. But in the subsequent period, a new form of power developed, namely corporations, with highly concentrated power over decision-making in economic life. That is, the control over what's produced, what's distributed, what's invested, and so on and so forth, is very narrowly concentrated.
So this is why the vice president of a large corporation would say the public mind is the chief thing.
The public mind might have funny ideas about democracy, which say that we should not be forced simply to rent ourselves to the people who own the country, rather, and own its institutions. Rather, we should play a role in determining what those institutions do. That's democracy. If we were to move towards democracy, and I think democracy even in the 18th century sense, we would say that there should be no maldistribution of power in determining what's produced, what's distributed, what's invested, and so on. Rather, that should be that's a problem for the entire community. In fact, there are, in my own personal view, unless we move in that direction, human society probably isn't going to survive.
Capitalism has a lot in common with the systems before, particularly slavery and feudalism. And here's what they have in common. A very small group of people, masters, lords, employers, are dominant, have the control and amass the wealth relative to the vast mass of people, the slaves or the serfs or the employees. This latter group, the majority, the vast majority, do the bulk of the work. The wealth produced is gathered into the hands of and controlled by the small group. A small group vis-a-vis a large group. That capitalism has in common with slavery and feudalism. And that means capitalism is subject to the same tensions and criticisms and revolutions that plagued slavery and feudalism. Why? Because sooner or later, when things go bad, the mass of people figure out that they're locked into a system where they get the short end of the stick. They are the majority, but the wealth they produce goes to somebody else. They are the majority, but the power is in the hands of somebody else. And they figure out that rather than begging as slaves that the master treat them better, or begging as serfs that the lord treat them better, or begging as employees that the employer treat them better, what they ought to do, maybe, is change the very system. Capitalism wasn't freedom. That capitalism didn't fundamentally change the situation of a few people with the wealth and power and everybody else without. It just changed the rules for that system. It replaced master-slave, lord-serf with employer-employee. So that what remained, if you were going to achieve the freedom that people in all those systems sooner or later felt, was a system that didn't organize production that way, that didn't divide the people who participate in producing and distributing goods and services into a minority with the wealth and power and a majority who do the work. And the only way to do that is to democratize the enterprise, whether it's a farm or a factory, a store or an office, to make it such that we don't have order givers, order takers, that everybody is a part of a community that together divides the work. Capitalism exists so long as you don't question, you don't criticize, and you don't move beyond yet another small group power, mass of workers situation. Capitalism didn't change that. It just gave it a new form. It went from master-slave, lord-serf, to employer-employee.
I think most Americans, if you'd ask them where do most low-income families live, they'd say public housing, or they benefit from some sort of housing voucher. But it's actually the opposite is true. About 45 million people in America are below the poverty line today. So only 1 in 4 low-income Americans that qualify for housing assistance receive anything from the federal government. That counts vouchers, that counts housing assistance, that counts public housing, all of that bundled up. Only 1 in 4 receive that. 3 out of 4 receive absolutely no assistance and have to make ends meet in the private market unassisted. A lot of times when we think about housing policy, we think of the lucky minority that do receive it. But we need a housing policy that matters for everyone else. And public housing does that. Whatever the faults public housing had, one thing it did was to keep rents lower for everyone else on the market. Housing is a direct cause of poverty in America today. It's not just about how little money people are making, it's about how much they are giving to live in some of the worst housing in the worst neighborhoods in America.
We said we're not going to fight capitalism with black capitalism, but we're going to fight it with socialism. Everything would be all right if everything was put back in the hands of the people, and we're going to have to put it back in the hands of the people.
They teach about the Black Panthers in China. I repeat, they teach about the Black Panthers in China, and they don't teach about the Black Panthers here. And they still shoot up Fred Hampton's grave every year. And people still got issues with the Chinese.
You don't judge Castro now. You can't do it. Nobody in this room could judge whether Castro's going to be a revolutionary or not. We're talking about things, you know what I mean, with China, the People's Republic, and even at the stage they're in now, talking about even going on further into a communistic state. That's what we're talking about. Those are revolutionary. So we got to understand here the educational program that you have to be able to figure out whether it will go on the right lines, where the people will end up in a situation where they can be able to really control themselves. You understand what I'm saying? With no education, the people take this local foundation and start stealing money because they won't be really educated to why it's the people's thing anyway. You understand what I'm saying? With no education, you have neo-colonialism instead of colonialism, like you got in Africa now, like you got in Haiti. So what we're talking about is there has to be educational program. That's very important. As a matter of fact, it's so important for us that a person has to go through 6 weeks of our political education before he can consider himself a member of the party, able to even run down ideology for the party. Why? Because if they don't have an education, then they're nowhere. You dig what I'm saying? They're nowhere because they don't even know why they're doing what they're doing.
Black people need some peace. White people need some peace. And we are going to have to fight. We're going to have to struggle. We're going to have to struggle relentlessly to bring about some peace because the people that we're asking for peace, they're a bunch of megalomaniac warmongers and they don't even understand what peace means. And we've got to fight them. We've got to struggle with them to make them understand what peace means. Bobby Seale is going through all types of physical and mental torture. But that's all right, because we said even before this happened, and we're going to say it after this, and after I'm locked up, and after everybody's locked up, that you can jail revolutionaries, but you can't jail a revolution. Right. You might run a liberator like Harris Cleave out the country, but you can't run liberation out the country. You might murder a freedom fighter like Bobby Hutton, but you can't murder freedom fighting.
I was right. I was right. Everything I say is right.
If we knew about Fred Hampton and how he founded the Black Panthers in Chicago, he united with the Brown Berets, a Hispanic organization, then he united with the Young Patriots, a white organization, and they formed the Rainbow Coalition, and they said that we got more in common than we don't, because we all poor, so we should be fighting together. Role models. Yuriko Chiyama, a Japanese American woman who got involved with the civil rights movement. We need role models. So who's going to be your anti-racist role model?
We get so much shit from China, and Hong Kong is one of the...
What's this? The sound of me being right? Because nobody wanted to listen to me when I started talking about China, and now guess who's one of the biggest players in this game? Leftists were right, leftists were right, leftists were right. Told y'all fake activists that the US would isolate itself economically. Y'all wanted to focus on fake causes. Y'all wanted to have popularity wars and witch hunts. Now an entire foreign government is about to make us their bitch. Y'all seriously want to argue over skin tones and race, like y'all are worse than the fucking opposition that y'all claim to hate. Meanwhile, other skin tones and racist and marginalized folks were telling y'all this shit was gonna happen, so I don't want to hear it from either side of this fascist coin. Y'all have two options now, and it's gonna be the most entertaining thing to watch. Keep bootlicking and go down with the ship or accept communism. You've wronged everyone so terribly they don't wish to teach you, but it's okay. The Chinese will teach you how to share. All because your leaders kept running their mouths. Now the US is really gonna learn how to be a team player.
Is to make it clear to them that socialism isn't about the government. In this country, United States, for the last 60 years that I've been awake, the way they handled the socialist threat was by saying socialism is when the government does everything, step one. Step two, whenever the government does anything, it's inefficient and wasteful and crude and ugly and smells bad. Okay, therefore socialism is crude, ugly, and smells bad. And they don't want anything to do with it. The beauty of this simplistic ideology is every time capitalism sticks it to the people, they get angry at the politicians. If you lay off 1,000 workers in your town in America, the people will get angry at the congressperson or the senator.
Who won't they get angry at?
The employer who fired them. When they get thrown out of their house because they're not making their mortgage payment.
It's not the bank.
It's not the lender, it's not the bank. You've treated people, you've given them an entire ideological structure. Badness is government. Badness is socialism. Socialism is government. Hate them all, and you're safe. When I talk about transforming the enterprise so that the workers democratically control it, I call it the democratization of the enterprise. In this country, democracy is considered good. Richard Wolff. I'm going to try to give you an overview of what the word, the concept, and the social movement called communism is all about. And it may be different, probably will be, from what you might have thought that word means. So let's begin at the very beginning. What is communism? Mostly, for most of human history that this word and this idea have circulated, I think it's fair to say it has been a utopian dream, an ideal, a notion that the human community, and notice, please, the same root, commune, community, communism, that the human community could function in a mutually respectful, mutually honest, mutually nurturant way as an idealized community in which what everybody contributed was what they knew best, loved to do, felt passionate about, and where everyone received from the community both physical and material, but also spiritual benefits, consumables, means of both a physical and mental life. Communism was a generic idea that this sort of community would be valuable in terms of where you live, valuable in terms of where you work, and valuable as a way to link up with other people, no matter what the particular activities you engaged in, which is why communistic communities, in this sense, have long existed for thousands of years. I'm going to give you just a few examples, which is why communistic communities, in this sense, have long existed for thousands of years. I'm going to give you just a few examples. I remember once traveling through France and noticing as I entered a village that it used to be called, and many of them still are called, communes. That's partly a description of their setup as a community, but partly a harking back to a notion of this mutually supportive ideal, this utopian ideal. You might also be struck to learn that in many religions, there are specific rules and commitments to that kind of interaction that you could call communism. People interested in communism have noticed that, for example, medieval Catholic monks, orders of nuns, and all kinds of spiritually engaged people organized their communities where they lived and where they worked in this mutually supportive way. Perhaps the most famous document about it is called, fittingly, the Communist Manifesto, written and published in 1848. That's a little over 150 years ago, by Marx and Engels. It talked a lot about what was wrong with society at that time, which they identified with capitalism, and what it was that they, as critics of capitalism, pointed to as an alternative that others who are either critics or victims of capitalism would be well advised to think about and to pursue. And their idea was quite simple, that this is something that has been around and will come back over and over again. Indeed, they opened the Communist Manifesto with that famous line about communism is like a ghost haunting modern society, with the image constantly of how things could be different and how things could be better. And I'm going to end today's program, as I'll show you, by suggesting to you that worker cooperatives in the workplace are an attempt to bring that ghost right back to life right now. Okay, even after the Communist Manifesto in the middle of the 19th century, for the rest of that century, what we had was a slow growth of those ideas, but not mostly under the word communism. That word faded and was replaced by the term socialism. Socialism became the great alternative to capitalism across the second half of the 19th century, around Europe, here in the United States, and pretty much globally as it spread. But it was always the notion of something fundamentally different from capitalism in ways that ought to make it more attractive, at least in the minds of those who were so persuaded. World War I changed everything. Indeed, the 50 years up to and into World War I were years of growing, horrible conflict. Most of that conflict was between European countries and the colonies that they either already had from an earlier time or acquired in the 18th and 19th century. The Russians competed against the British to shape colonies, the French against the Germans, the Belgians against the Americans. There were endless wars, small and large, throughout what we now call Asia, Africa, Latin America, and so on. And then it all came to a head when the final war, World War I, thought to be final at the time, because it was the worst war human society had ever seen, killed 20 million people, half military, half civilian. But it came after colonial wars that killed many millions more, including here in the United States, where the 18th and 19th century were literally continuous warfare between the Europeans who arrived here and the native people who were systematically destroyed. Anything as cataclysmic as a world war, let alone one that comes after wars that killed many millions more, shook everything. Modern society has never overcome the scars of World War I. And one of the things that happened was to shake socialism. It had grown dramatically from the middle of the 19th century up until World War I, but World War I split modern socialism into two groups. One group, dramatically from the middle of the 19th century up until World War I, but World War I split modern socialism into two groups. One group ended up keeping the name. We are critics of capitalism, we want to do better, and we call ourselves socialists. But another group was critical of this first group, and they said, you're not doing enough, you're not going far enough, you haven't come up with a really worked out answer. We're determined to go further, and we're going to call ourselves something else. We're going to call ourselves communists. That's when the term takes on a whole new meaning. Because what happened in almost all of the countries where there was a socialist party was that that party split into a socialist party and into a new communist party. And all the socialists had to pick sides. Which way are you going to go? With the socialists or with the communists? One of the key issues, not the only one, but one of the key issues had to do with World War I. The socialists were those who decided they had to go with their own country. They had to go to war, World War I, fight the war as German socialists or British socialists or American socialists. And that would put them against, of course, socialists in other countries who were soldiers or affected civilians. But others said, no, this is not a war that we as socialists should fight, because it's a war that's the product of capitalism. It's a war among countries dominated by capitalists. It's the fruit of their endless quest to make money by controlling all the rest of the planet in the colonial territories they warred over for much of the 19th century. We don't want to be part of it. And the interesting thing was those who refused to be partisan in the war included both the head of the Socialist Party in the United States, Eugene Victor Debs, and the head of the equivalent party in Russia, Lenin. Both of them said, this is not our war, we are not going to fight in it, and urged Russians not to take up arms against working class people in other countries, as Mr. Debs did. Lenin was exiled, Debs was jailed for taking such a position. but it began to make very clear what some of the differences were between socialists and communists. Then there was the revolution in Russia, where, under the leadership of the same Lenin, for the first time, socialists came to power. And the question was, what were they? Which kind of socialists? But Lenin, by having taken his position against the war, could not and would not go back to the old socialism, so they became the Communist Party. And they took over Russia, the government. They won the civil war there. They solidified the revolution. They became the power in Russia for the next 70 years. And in every other country, including the United States, communist parties split off from the Socialist Party. Now, they were all beholden to Marx's ideas, among many. They were all beholden to a critique and rejection of capitalism. But they went in different directions to articulate that, to make it clear, and to define not only what they meant vis-a-vis capitalism, but why and how they differed one from the other. But a couple of key points need to be made as we come to the end of the first half of today's program. None of these organizations ever believed or ever said that they had established communism. None of these organizations ever believed or ever said that they had established communism. The socialists never said that, and the communists never said that. What distinguished them was what they proposed to do on their way to a future idealized utopian thing that they would sometimes call communism. But the notion that what failed in the Soviet Union was communism is a notion no Communist Party official ever articulated. That's not what they thought they were doing. They were transitional. They were on their way to communism, but they weren't there yet, not by a long shot. In our analysis of communism, we left off in the aftermath of World War I, when the socialist parties around the world, which had become strong by then, split between a socialist party, which was probably the larger, and a communist party. That's the people who split off. And this happened, as I said, in almost every country where there had been a socialist party. And for most of the rest of the 20th century, until the last decade of the 20th century, there was a bitter, ongoing struggle between the Socialist Party, and the Communist Party. And I want to stress what the differences were. The socialists came to believe that what they were about was mobilizing voters, above all else, in alliance with trade unions, to exert political power, either by becoming the government or shaping government policy, to make the mass of people better off. They championed public housing, public transport, subsidized medical care, and a whole host of things that have become common parts of many countries in which socialists achieved these kinds of things. They did not challenge private enterprise, private capitalism, employer-employee structure of enterprises. They left that in private capitalist hands, with some few exceptions, but not many. The socialism consisted of government regulation, government oversight. In a sense, and this phrase was common, socialism is sort of like capitalism, except it has a human face. It takes care of people in a way that capitalism, if left to itself, to the pure private market, never would. And how was this different from communism? Communism believed that that was not going far enough, that the condition of workers was never good enough. And even if it was, it only was so because the private capitalists tolerated it. And when they wouldn't anymore, whatever had been given to the workers would be taken back. They would look at the last 50 years of the United States as the undoing of the New Deal. Socialists helped get that in the 1930s, but because of the power of the private sector they left standing, it was all taken back ever since. So the argument of the communists was the government has to go further, not merely regulate, but literally take over, own, and operate the industries, the agriculture, to make sure that what was done for the benefit of the society as a whole and not primarily for the small group who live off profits. Because the socialists left the private capitalists in charge, these societies were not torn apart the way the communist societies were, because there was so much resistance within the communist societies to the government taking it all over and running it. And that led to different levels of civil liberties, civil rights, and so on, which were then part of what the struggle between socialists and communists was all about. From time to time, they set aside their differences and worked together. But in general, they were competing to the same working class, in one case saying, this is the way you should go if you're a socialist, and the communists saying, no, this is the way you should go if you're a communist. That's how it continued roughly from the end of World War I, 1918, 1919, until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989. With that, the Communist Party of Russia and the communist parties in other parts of the world collapsed. They had tied their well-being to Russia. Russia was their leader. Soviet communism was what they talked about. This, by the way, USSR, just to remind you all, Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. They did not call themselves a communist society. As I said, they never did. Communism was where they were going. Communism was the name of their party, was not the name of the system they were still in. That was at best transitional toward, but not itself, a communist society. But with the end of the communist parties even pushing that, we went back, as it were, to the pre-World War I world, in which there were only socialists of one kind or another, and most of them believed that the government shouldn't do more than regulate capitalism, somehow getting the best of what that system had, but forcing it to take care of people in a way that without government intervention would never have happened. In other words, the state provides health care, free education, subsidized transport, subsidized housing, and all the rest. But you know, this accommodation to the collapse of the Soviet Union was never universal. That spirit that Marx wrote about, that ghost that haunts the modern world, this image of a communism really different from capitalism, never went away. And in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union after 1989, all of the people who still believed in that, and there were millions of them, began a process of self-criticism. What had gone wrong? Why did the Soviet Union collapse? Why was it unable to survive, let alone take us in a transitional way to this communism that people believed in and wanted, this community where we nurture and care for and develop one another? And they reached a conclusion over the last 10 years, 15 years, that there was a crucial element missing in both what the socialist parties did and what the communist parties did. That if we corrected that, these folks said, we could resume the transition to a really different society that would embody what communism always meant for the centuries. And here was the idea. Neither the socialists in places like Scandinavia or Western Europe, the social democracies, all of that, nor the communists understood that a problem was the way capitalism had organized work. They had organized it so that there were two groups, a very small group called employers, capitalists, and a very large group called employees, workers. One of them was rich and powerful, and the other one wasn't. I won't have to spell it out because you all already know. The small group of employers worked the economy so they would be rich and powerful, more so as time went on. In that way, the few, the capitalists, resembled the few masters in slave systems, the few lords in feudal systems. Capitalism hadn't broken out of that small group dominating large group in the economy. And because the socialists and the communists didn't change that, the socialists let the private capitalists run their businesses in the capitalist way. The Communist Party people in Russia, China, Cuba, North Korea, and so on, they did the same. They didn't let private capitalists run the business. They had state officials doing it. Again, a very small number of state officials making the decisions for the mass of the working class. One was private capitalism, one was state capitalism, but neither was anything like the communism that was in this kind of socialist's mind, particularly after the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe fell apart.